Hello and welcome to what is going to be an introduction video to Predations, Vainglory of Empires. Predations is a grand strategy game developed in 2011 by a French development company, I think called Agiod. They sort of kind of exist now, but they've been folded into Slytherin. And the game depicts European history from 1850 to 1920, and it sort of encompasses quite a lot: economic development, diplomacy, colonization, and military affairs. And even though it's a pretty dated game, and even though it kind of fell short of its brief a little bit, I wouldn't go so far as to say it was panned, but it's certainly a problematic game. It's not quite finished, so a couple of the features in the game don't actually work. It's a little bit buggy, so some events, for example, you just get kind of like sort of code text. Although I'm running a bug fix, so a lot of that has kind of been dealt with. And the turn times are really long, and that's not subject to your processor power or anything like that. You'd think that kind of because it's an old game that it would run really fast, and that's not the case. It's just that the game engine wasn't quite up to the kind of task of the ambitious project that they tried to develop. But I'd say that even with all of those shortcomings, and the fact that it's dated, I'd say that it's hand over fist better than most grand strategy games that have been developed since. And I'm certainly someone that's of the view that the halcyon days of grand strategy gaming are kind of over in a sense. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't good grand strategy games out there that are being made, that have been made. And I think there are some, like even mainstream games that are definitely playable and they're quite good fun. But I think there's a kind of trend, there's a tendency in grand strategy gaming now to go towards kind of very plush UI and stuff like that. But I think increasingly the games are quite superficial. They're kind of not very plausible in terms of the historical outcomes that you have and this sort of thing. And I think their replayability value is really limited as well. I actually find them quite boring, even though they look really nice. But this kind of grand strategy game, I think, is great. Like, it's a real long-term commitment to play this kind of game. I'm going to pick a faction. I'm going to be playing the grand campaign that starts in 1850, and in real time, this campaign, which I intended to try and depict on YouTube in some fashion, it's going to last probably 2 years in real time. 2 years would be 15 turns a week. A year is like 30 turns a week. So I'm thinking realistically a year to 2 years. So it's quite a commitment. And I've never seen anyone on YouTube complete a grand campaign in Pride of Nations. Because it is just such a commitment. It's so huge. I think players naturally sort of, especially if they're kind of streaming games, they sort of think there's probably not going to be much interest in following the same game for that length of time. And they'll start focusing on another game, or they get bored themselves, The turn times are quite long as well, so it's, as I mentioned, so it's another game that lends itself well to kind of traditional stream-style videos, where you kind of watch someone play a game for an hour, or half hour to an hour. It'd be quite boring to do that, because a lot of the turns are going to be taken up with just economic administration and this kind of thing. It's much like real life. Long periods of inactivity punctuated by periods of warfare, chaos and crisis, and that's mapped really well in Pride of Nations. I'm going to show you the options that I'm going to be running. I won't go through every single option, but basically I'm going to be running the game to offer the most realistic kind of historical game, I think. So, for example, Spheres of Influence and Claims, I'm having to fairly historical, which means that this is not a game where we're going to be kind of completely rewriting history, which is the kind of often the desire for modern grand strategy games to try and provide the opportunity for people to do that, to do kind of the unthinkable, to conquer Europe as Belgium or something like this. This is not on the cards in this kind of game. This sort of game is, to kind of quote Bismarck, you're kind of swimming with history. You're much more swimming with history in this kind of game. There are some things you just cannot change about the faction that you're playing. You can still achieve ahistorical outcomes, but they're kind of limited. They're within the confines of what would be considered acceptable, plausible, permissible during this period. So this is the kind of game settings that we have. I've got the AI set to kind of use all behaviors and give AI more time to, to give us the best kind of challenge that we can possibly have. And this is the system setup. That's pretty much an introduction to the game. And my next video will introduce the faction that I'm going to play. And I'll talk a bit about the faction, a bit about the history of the faction, and try and provide a kind of decent introduction to what's going to be, hopefully, like an entire grand campaign playthrough. I should say that I'm not going to stream the game. The idea is to provide a kind of campaign diary. So certainly during certain periods, I'll play through turns and I'll record those turns and talk about the turns and what I'm doing. But I'm not going to do that with every turn because it would be incredibly dull to watch and frankly dull to make as well. So I'm going to try and maybe, we'll see how the kind of tempo works out, but I'll try and do quarterly reports. So every 3 months I'll deliver a report on what's happened over the previous 3 months, the plans that I have, and so on and so forth. So that there's enough there that there's kind of continuity between each video. It's kind of half interesting to watch, at least if you're interested in these kind of games and you're interested in history. And yeah, I think the kind of the frequency of the videos will hopefully kind of mirror the momentum, the tempo of the game. So during periods of kind of warfare and more interesting sort of periods, then I'll do very regular videos and may even sort of pass through multiple turns whilst kind of, whilst recording. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this introduction video, and I'll see you in the next video, which will be the first kind of, the introduction to the faction and the beginning of the Grand Campaign.